Hello, students of biology and plant biology. You're welcome to the next module. But before then, let me begin by sending my apologies to you for the rather somewhat long silence. In fact, this was due to a technical issue with my system. I kindly apologize for that. So, you're welcome to Module 4, which basically focuses on writing skills. This model is further divided into two sections. The first section focuses on writing. By way of introduction, the model centers on writing skills, skills which dwell mainly on practice, coupled with a good knowledge of grammar, punctuation, and spelling. Grammar generally concentrates on the style and arrangement of words, while punctuation makes meaning possible, which means then an inappropriate use of punctuation marks will render a particular utterance meaningless, absurd, and even sometimes bizarre. Uh, what is writing? Writing is a form of communication in an accepted, orderly, and logical written form. It is a way of translating sounds into readable codes and symbols. In writing generally, alphabets are combined to form words, and words to form phrases, which are further developed into sentences, and later sentences into paragraphs, which then developed into meaningful essays, chapters, and even whole books or volumes of books. The aim of writing is primarily to convey the inner thoughts of the writer to the reader or recipient. In writing, there are what we call the essentials of good handwriting, of good writing. These are: one, writing must satisfy the purpose of the writer and the reader. Two, it must be well thought out, such that the reader is able to identify its theme or subject and purpose. A writer should also choose a subject matter in which he or she is knowledgeable, or one which he can find adequate materials in order to be fully developed. It must also be in an organized way so that the reader can identify the trend. It must also be coherent. In other words, all the parts must live together as well as show a particular direction of thought. The words chosen must also be sufficiently comprehensible for the reader to understand the contents of the writing. The grammatical structures must also be correct. For example, use of concord, spelling of words, and correct punctuation. The writing must be legible. In other words, easy to read and understand. It must also be put in its right channel. For example, whether it's a report, a letter, minutes, articles, memorandum, communique, and so on. It must also be logical. The thoughts and ideas must be sensible enough for the reader to get the message easily. It must also be in a sequential manner. It should also mix the sentence structures using simple, complex, and compound sentences. It should express one idea in a paragraph, choosing a topic sentence and developing it in the paragraph with the topic sentence containing the main idea. If it's not a fictional work, it must be factual. Fiction allows imaginations, while factual writing admits accuracy and verifiable facts. If possible, it should illustrate ideas with data, visuals, for example, charts, graphs, diagrams, pictures, and so on. A good writing should also be concise and precise without wasting words because of cost and time of the reader. If there is need to quote or use other people's original work, that must be acknowledged. Otherwise, the writer would be guilty of plagiarism or piracy. That is what we call intellectual theft. Now, paragraph development. What is a paragraph? A paragraph is a group of sentences that express a single idea. The first sentence of the paragraph is normally indented, that is, it begins a little bit more to the right of the margin than the rest of the sentences in the group. A paragraph can be marked by leaving a blank line from the preceding paragraph. Now, the topic sentence. The topic sentence is the most important sentence in a paragraph. It introduces what the paragraph is all about and usually states an idea or an attitude. Now, how do we recognize the topic sentence in a particular paragraph? Well, there's no specific position for a topic sentence. As such, it can come either at the beginning, middle, or towards the end of a particular paragraph. In some instances, the topic sentences may not be evident in a paragraph. Rather, it may be implied. And in this case, one needs to read attentively in order to locate the topic sentence. The next item is essay writing. When we see essay, it means any short piece of writing that interprets or analyzes a situation. For example, class assignment. Essays may describe situations, that is descriptive. They may narrate events or happenings, that is narrative. They may give instruction on how to do something, that is expository, or they may try to convince the reader to follow a particular course of action, which is normally referred to as the argumentative or persuasive essay. All essays should contain three parts, that is, the introduction, the body, and finally the conclusion. Now, this essay is further subdivided into four types, which are the narrative, the descriptive, the expository, and the argumentative or persuasive. A narrative essay is the kind of essay that tells a story or narrates something that happens in the past, which means that the tense to be used is normally the past tense because it's like a kind of recounting or recollection of an event that has already happened. So it normally uses the past tense. The second type of essay is the descriptive essay, which tries to give a clear picture of something, of a situation or an event. For example, its outlooks, its behavior, and so on. Here, adverbs, adjectives, figures of speech, metaphor, simile are normally used in an extensive way in order to clearly bring out or describe the situation in a clear manner. Argumentative essay. This is the kind of essay that presents a point of view convincingly for the reader to either share or to agree. It is normally meant to persuade someone or to prove a point or discuss problem by trying to provide solution to them. The last type of essay is what is known as the expository essay, which involves giving explanation or directions. For example, directive on how to operate a certain machinery or how to cook a particular style of meal, and so on and so forth. The next item is letter writing. Well, despite the prevalence of emails, text messages, and other forms of communication nowadays, letter writing is still adhered to as a means of communication, especially in formal situations, as in organizations, schools, or companies. This letter writing has been divided into different categories, but scholars do not share a unified view about how letters should be classified. Some scholars categorize it into two, that is the formal and informal letter, while others believe that there should still be the existence of a semi-formal type of letter, which then brings the classification into three. Well, in all this, the most important thing to bear in mind is that a letter is determined mostly by the language, the tone, physical features, and the purpose of the letter. Now, let's look at these kinds of letters one by one. The first is the formal letter, which is otherwise known as an official or business letter. For example, application for a job, letter of complaint, letter of request, or letter of inquiry. The language in a formal letter should be strictly formal, clear, concise, and straight to the point, which means that use of slangs, cliché, abbreviations, or ambiguity are not accepted in this kind of letter writing. Now, what is the format of a letter writing? Or of a formal letter, sorry, the format of writing a formal letter. First of all, there should be the address. In formal letter, the address is two. First of all, there should be the address of the writer, otherwise known as the addressor, and that of the recipient, known as the addressee. This address can be written either in blocked or slanted form and must be written in full with the exception of formal abbreviations such as PMB or PO Box. The address of the writer is written at the top right-hand side of the first page, followed by the date. This is followed at the left-hand side of the page by the address of the recipient, which starts at the first line following the last line of the address of the writer. In this case, also abbreviations such as cent for seat for street, RD for road, and so on are not allowed. In other words, these abbreviations are not allowed either in the address of the recipient or in the address of the writer or the addresser. Secondly, there's the date. The date in a formal letter should be written immediately below the address of the writer and before the address of the recipient, and it should be followed by a full stop. These examples are some of the ways of writing the date. You can see them in the slides. The next item is the salutation. Salutation is a kind of greeting with which the writer opens up his or her letter, and it's written at the left-hand side of the paper immediately below the address of the recipient. The salutation is almost always followed by a comma. For example, dear sir, comma, dear madam, comma, and so on. And here the abbreviations are allowed with titles. For example, Mr. After MR and dot, you can write a comma. Likewise, in other abbreviations like Mrs., Miss, Doctor, and so on. However, one can decide to drop the full stop up to each title. The fourth item in the format for writing a formal letter is the title or heading of the letter. And this is written below the salutation, and it shows the subject matter of the letter. Titles or headings can be written in either upper or lower case. However, if written in lower case, titles must be underlined. The next item is body of the letter. In the body of the letter, you find that this is where all information that the letter entails seem to pass. The section also contains the introduction, the body, which is the middle, and then the conclusion of the letter. The introductory part gives background information on and purpose of the letter, while the middle part presents and develops the item of information the letter is intended for in the short paragraphs, while the concluding part states the desire or hope about what should happen next, and this is done in order to avoid abrupt ending of the letter. And next is the complementary clause, otherwise known as the subscription. And this is written about 2 lines from the body of the letter at the left or right of the page, depending on the choice of the writer. But the most acceptable form of complementary clause or subscription in formal letters is yours sincerely, where yours should be where the Y should begin with a capital letter and faithfully should all be written in small case. Other alternative ways of closing formal letters include yours truly, best regards, yours sincerely, or sincerely yours, and so on. We should also note that the first letter of the complementary clause is written in uppercase. A comma should be used at the end of the complementary clause before the signature and the name of the writer. For example, once you write yours sincerely, you should have a comma, or yours faithfully, there should be a comma, and then your signature the next should be in the next line, and then your name. The next item is the signature and name of the writer. The signature of the writer should follow the complementary clause or subscription, then his or her full name. A woman should identify her gender by indicating her marital status. Put in Miss if she's not married and Mrs. if she's married, or else simply write capital M and small s, which applies to both married and unmarried women and tend to make your marital status somewhat ambiguous because it can apply in both cases, whether married or unmarried. All these titles should be written in bracket after her full name. And on this next slide, you can see an example of a formal letter where you have the address of the writer on the right, and then immediately the next line, you have the address of the recipient on the left, as we have discussed, and then you have the salutation, dear madam, and then the heading, letter of request for deferment of my studies, and then the body of the letter, and then towards the end, you have the complementary clause or subscription, followed by your signature and full name. Anyway, it's there. You can easily see it on this slide. The second kind of letter writing is the informal letter. As the name implies, it is the kind of letter written to people we are acquainted to, such as friends, family members, relatives, and so on. In other words, this type of letter is a personal one, and as it can be written for different purposes. For example, uh, you can write an informal letter simply just to say hello, to greet someone, to congratulate someone, or condole them. In contrast to the case of a formal letter, the language of informal letter is not expected to be highly selective in any case. Rather, anything can come in here. For example, you can crack jokes, even though the level of familiarity may differ from one person to another. For example, the language one uses to, for example, a senior colleague or a senior person will be quite different from the one you use to your colleagues, friends, and other younger acquaintances. Now, in the case of format, there is also there are some differences between the formal and informal letter, even though they share some items, but you find that in one way or the other, there are instances where they differ. First, format of an informal letter is the address. Informal letters only have the address of the writer written at the top right-hand side of the first page, followed by the date, which means that it shares this with that of a formal letter because it is also written in the same way, the same format. But in this case, there's only one address. The writer may decide to punctuate the address and the date, or he or she may leave them out. That is accepted for an informal letter. The second item to be considered is the date, which should be written below. Third is the salutation. In contrast to the formal letter, the informal letter salutation usually takes almost anything you want. For example, it could be, dear Mariam, dear Peter, my dear so, my dear mother, dad, or anything, for example, for close relatives or some acquaintances. We should also note that a writer may decide to write the salutation in upper and lower case as the above examples show, or he or she may capitalize only the first letter of the salutation, as in, my dear brother, Abu. And the salutation should also be followed by a comma. Now, the body of the letter. This is a situation where the writer explains the message he or she wants to convey to the reader. The tone of the language of informal letter is very important as it shows the level of familiarity and closeness between the two parties. And in these kinds of letters, a writer may share jokes or use idioms and slangs and so on. And as I've said earlier, any language can come in. Maybe the only difference could be in terms of the relationship between the writer and the recipient, or the closeness between them. The next item here is the complementary clause. For informal letter, the complementary clause or subscription may include any of these forms. For example, yours sincerely, yours affectionately, yours loving daughter, yours so and so on and so forth. The complementary clause should also be followed by a comma. And the next item is the name of the writer, which should be written below the complementary clause. On this slide, now we have an example of an informal letter, which I'm sure if you all go through, you can see it. We have the address of the writer on the right-hand side, at top right-hand side, and then immediately after it, at the left-hand side, you have the salutation, dear sir, and then immediately after, you have the body of the letter, which can contain anything you so want, in contrast to that of a formal letter. And then immediately after that, you have the complementary clause or subscription, yours sincerely, and then the name, which means that in this case, there's no earthly reason why you should include any signature. In fact, if you do, that's all right, but it's not necessary, as you have seen in this example provided on this slide. Now, the semi-formal letter. A semi-formal letter is a letter which shares some features of formal and some of informal letter. And this is why it is particularly referred to as a semi-formal, because it is not strictly formal and also not informal in any sense of the word, but rather it is a combination of both features, that is of the informal and the formal. This kind of letter contains only the address of the writer followed by salutation. For example, dear Mr. Taiwo, dear sir, and so on. And then it is followed by the body of the letter, which should be written in a polite and respectful manner. However, the language should not be too serious to the extent that the letter looks more formal than semi-formal. The closing of a semi-formal letter may move from formal to less formal. Thus, the letter can be closed with yours sincerely, yours truly, best regards, cordially, yours, and so on and so forth. And finally, the writer should write his or her name in full, or his initials and the surname below the complementary. Well, this brings us to the end of the first lecture of Module 4, and inshallah, we shall soon meet in the second lecture of the same module. Thank you. Good day.